Hello, everyone. My name is Linnea Anderson. I'm the archivist in the Social Welfare History Archives. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Archives and Special Collections Department, welcome to First Fridays Online. Today's presentations will also be posted later on the University of Minnesota Library's YouTube channel, so you should be able to access them within the next few weeks. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former Library Director Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's archives and special collections. A special thank you to Alan and Jason from Middle English Interpreting, who will be providing ASL interpretation for today's presentations. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use Q&A and not the chat so that we can keep track of your questions. You can submit your questions at any time, but we are going to hold them until the end of the presentations as time allows. We will now pause for a land acknowledgement. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. Our presentations today are by Kate Dietrick from the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives and Amanda Wick from the Charles Babbage Institute Archives. And our first presentation is The Flying Jewish Chaplain by Kate Dietrick. While serving as military chaplain during World War II, Rabbi Harold H. Gordon was a circuit chaplain for the North Atlantic Division of the Air Transport Command. We're going to learn more about Rabbi Gordon, nicknamed the Flying Jewish Chaplain, as he logged over 200,000 miles of flying at a time when flying was still novel and not without peril, to bring spiritual guidance to members of the armed forces. Thanks, Kate.
Hello, thank you so much. All right, so my introduction to Harold H. Gordon dates back to the beginning of my time here at the university. When I started in this position in 2013, I talked a lot with then executive director of the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest, Catherine Tain, about a myriad of topics. And one tiny snippet of information that I retained was simply dog sledding rabbi. Afterwards, when I looked back, I thought, did I hear that correctly? Should I go back and ask what that was about? But more pressing matters reigned as I stored that snippet of knowledge away, knowing that one day I would stumble across it as I made my way through the archives. And indeed, one day, while going through unprocessed collections, I found it. The dog sledding rabbi. The story behind the photos took a little bit more digging. The papers of Rabbi Harold H. Gordon make up a relatively small collection consisting of 7 photo albums, a scrapbook, manuscript, and miscellaneous documents, all housed in just 2 boxes. When I first came across the collection, the photo albums were not in great shape. Photos had fallen off the pages, scattering everywhere. Those that remained were mounted on the popular to the era black paper that is acidic, which harms photos over time. But this small but powerful collection tells the remarkable experiences of Rabbi Gordon as he served as United States Army Air Force chaplain from 1942 to 1946. The photographs and scrapbooks materials illuminate his unique work as a traveling circuit chaplain during an era where air travel remained mostly outside the average person's experience. But the photos we had in the collection had very little identification or details attached to them. As I prepared for this presentation, I was able to flesh out details behind Harold's life through newly digitized and thus keyword searchable issues of the American Jewish World newspaper, Talmud Torah scrapbooks, old high school yearbooks, census records, and University of Minnesota student directories. The most valuable resource was a publication, Chaplain on Wings, the wartime memoirs of Rabbi Harold H. Gordon. Published in 1981, 4 years after Rabbi Gordon's death, the book partially draws from an unfinished autobiographical manuscript that we have in the collection. All of these sources together provide context that brought these archival photos to life. Harold Hirsch Gordon was born on December 15, 1907, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to parents Jacob and Nellie. If the 1910 census is to be believed, Jacob and Nellie migrated to the United States from Vilna, Russia, right at the turn of the century, with 4 of their children. Their family would eventually consist of a total of 2 daughters and 6 sons, Harold being born towards the end of the crew. The 1910 census lists Jacob Gordon with an occupation of kosherman, working at a slaughterhouse. In fact, Jacob held the title of reverend, serving the Orthodox community of Shari Zedek in North Minneapolis. North Minneapolis was at that time home to a large concentration of Jews and a number of Jewish congregations. Just to note, Shari Zedek went on to merge with another congregation in 1969 and is now known as Shari Hesed. Shari Zedek's old building still stands at 1119 Morgan Avenue and became a Baptist church. By the 1930s, the family resided at 1024 Morgan Avenue North, mere blocks from Shari Zedek. Undoubtedly, Jacob's role with the synagogue served as a spiritual model for the young Harold. When Jacob passed away in 1955, the American Jewish World noted, quote, "The passing of the patriarch, the Reverend Jacob Gordon, known to virtually every resident of North Minneapolis, was a stunning blow. For 45 years, Mr. Gordon was, with his eye undimmed and his mind still clear up to his 86th year, had led the Hevra Mishnah daily at Shari Zedek's synagogue, of which he was a charter member. He is truly irreplaceable in the Jewish community." Young Harold attended North High School, graduating in January of 1925. His yearbook quote reads, "A quiet tongue shows a wise head," which I personally feel illuminates a lot about what kind of person he must have been. Harold then went on to Chicago to attend the Orthodox Hebrew Theological College while also attending secular college, eventually transferring and returning to receive his BA from the University of Minnesota in 1929. He then went to New York to attend Jewish Theological Seminary and then returned for more graduate study at the University of Minnesota. His ties to the University of Minnesota remained strong throughout his life, as he mentions in his autobiography, affectionately following the U of M football while in the armed service. After completing studies at Jewish Theological Seminary, Rabbi Gordon served as the spiritual leader of Congregation Sons of Jacob in Waterloo, Iowa, from 1935 to 1942. During this time in Iowa, he remained tied to the Twin Cities. His work in Iowa is referenced throughout those years in the Minneapolis-based American Jewish World newspaper. In 1936, they ran the proud notice that, quote, "Rabbi Harold H. Gordon, former Minneapolitan, last week confirmed Waterloo, Iowa's first confirmation class in the history of that town's Jewry." He also remained connected to Talmud Torah, returning to Minneapolis to give presentations to students and sent them various telegrams. But then in December 1941, everything changed as the United States entered World War II. Only 2 months later, in February 1942, the National Jewish Welfare Board invited Rabbi Gordon to become director of USO clubs in Maryland. He then volunteered for military chaplaincy and attended chaplain school at Harvard University. The June 1943 issue of the American Jewish World, in the quote, "With Our Fighting Men" section, shares a photograph under the title, "Rabbis Prepare for Active Service at Harvard Chaplain School." Harold H. Gordon stands proudly in the back of the photograph. After chaplain school, he was assigned to the U.S. Army Air Force Basic Training Centers, first in St. Petersburg and eventually in Miami Beach. This is where the first scrapbook and photos in our collection pick up during his time stationed in Miami Beach. Miami Beach was a basic training center where, according to Gordon's autobiography, quote, "Groups of men from many places and a variety of Jewish religious backgrounds arrived every day." Rabbi Gordon's role was to provide spiritual guidance to a rotating cast of young Jewish men from across the country, leading Jewish services and lending support to young men preparing to be sent off to the perils of war. Here we have an undated basic introduction letter that Rabbi Gordon sent out. And I want to read most of this letter because I feel it's really powerful and there's a lot going on here. Quote, "Dear soldier, just a line to say hello and a hearty welcome to BTC number 9. There isn't much we can say to you to clarify the confusion of your first few days in the Army. There's no help for it. Everyone goes through it, even the chaplain. In a short while, though, you'll be in the swing of things, an integral part of the United Nations war machine. Your training is very tough, and so are your sergeants. But when it's over and done with, there will be a spring in your step and an unusual toughness in your arms. You'll be ready for your next step in your training as aviators flying in the cause of the miserable and downtrodden, many of whom are your fellow Jews. As Americans, you have, of course, a vital stake in this war. As Jews, that stake is intensified. You have scores to settle for buddies in Warsaw and Berlin, as well as in Bataan and Corregidor. Start settling these scores now. Drill like a thorough soldier because in the long flight, it will make you a more effective instrument in the destruction of a dastardly enemy. If ever something troubles you, know where you can find me. Foolish men will tell you it's sissy-like to see the chaplain when you have worries. Forget it, soldier. It takes maturity and intelligence to resolve your troubles as quickly as you can. Always sincerely, Harold H. Gordon, Chaplain, First Lieutenant." So first, I immediately noticed Rabbi Gordon's mention of fellow Jews. He says as aviators, these men will, quote, "be flying in the cause of the miserable and downtrodden, many of whom are your fellow Jews. As Americans, you have, of course, a vital stake in this war. As Jews, that stake is intensified." I cannot imagine what it must have been like for young Jewish servicemen as they prepared to enter the war. By this time, it was quite well known what was happening to Jews throughout Europe. He goes on, quote, "You have scores to settle for buddies in Warsaw and Berlin, as well as in Bataan and Corregidor." And here we see Rabbi Gordon acknowledge the multiple identities held by Jewish soldiers. Buddies, AKA fellow Jews, in Berlin, the seat of Nazi power, and Warsaw, the site of a large Jewish ghetto, as well as buddies, AKA fellow soldiers, who fought in battles in Bataan and Corregidor. Finally, the letter aims to dispel any sort of shame that soldiers might feel in wanting to seek out a chaplain for counseling and emotional support. For an introduction letter, it certainly packs a punch. Rabbi Gordon also sent small cards to servicemen. Here we have a blank one that notifies the person of the date of a Jewish service and ends with the somewhat pushy line, "Will you make an effort to attend?" It's certainly less shame-inducing than this next letter, again inviting the person to attend service. Quote, "Attendance by all of us at service is a privilege accorded to us in the Army through the offices of the War Department. It is a gracious privilege, one which is denied to soldiers of the Nazi and Japanese armies. Let us not abuse this privilege by trusting the other fellow to attend. Jewish men, women, and children have been slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands only because they were the ambassadors of the oldest and most deeply rooted democratic tendency in the world. They express this tendency Jewishly in humility and worship. Proud Jewish soldiers will remember those who died in the faith, that we may have a chance to carry it forward. Remember the schedule then and make every effort to come along with your buddies. Again, these invitations tug at the sense of Jewishness and duty. There's no word in the scrapbooks on how successful these invitations were in getting young Jewish soldiers to attend service. The rabbi's autobiography does note, quote, "Truth to tell, Miami Beach definitely was not an ideal testing ground for gauging the interest of Jewish servicemen." In his work, Rabbi Gordon served alongside chaplains of other faiths. A 1943 article titled "Clerics in Khaki, Real Guys Who Know Answers" mentions Rabbi Gordon alongside 4 other chaplains from the Protestant and Catholic faith. A photo of all 5 of them is staged, awkwardly under a flag bearing a Christian cross. Here we have a program that outlines the Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant services that were held at the training base. Rabbi Gordon's memoir speaks highly of his fellow chaplains and how they worked together across religious divides with mutual respect. Sometimes Jewish services were held on Saturdays, which is the Jewish Sabbath, but sometimes services were held on Sundays, as we see here for the Sunday, May 16th, 1943. Rabbi Gordon's autobiography details the reason for this. Quote, "In theory, Army regulations provided that soldiers of every religion were to be given equal opportunity to worship according to the dictates of their faith. In practice, however, it was more difficult for Jewish soldiers to attend religious services and to observe Sabbath and holiday than it was for their non-Jewish comrades at arms." He notes that Friday evenings, the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath, were usually spent as a cleanup night in preparation for weekly Saturday inspections, or time was spent with scheduled Friday night recreational service. As for Saturday mornings, it was quite impossible for a Jewish soldier on an army base to, quote, "go to shul" unless he happened to be off duty that day. I know of many Jewish GIs who, rather than submit to the embarrassment of asking a none too friendly first sergeant for permission to go to service, preferred to drop the matter altogether. On the other hand, on Sunday mornings, except in emergencies, no activity was permitted to interfere with religious services on a regular Army reservation. Here, Rabbi Gordon lays out how the Army made space for religion to be observed on the Christian Sabbath, so Jewish chaplains seem to therefore sometimes schedule their services then. Jewish holidays, however, were a different affair than regular services. In the daily bulletin for the base, notices went out informing of upcoming Jewish holidays and granting permission for enlisted men of the Jewish faith to observe the holiday. Passover appears to be a favorite Jewish holiday of Rabbi Gordon's. His autobiography speaks of Passover more than any other Jewish holiday, which I totally get because Passover is my favorite Jewish holiday too. There's an array of snacks and there's a reading of a book. What's not to love? But for Rabbi Gordon, Passover was an extreme undertaking. Again, his autobiography, quote, "By the spring of 1943, there was some 8,000 Jewish soldiers in Miami Beach. The Jewish chaplain's office had to see to it that the Jewish boys received time off to celebrate the Sedarim, either on the base or in private homes." He goes on to explain how he wanted most men to celebrate Passover in private homes instead of large communal seders, in hope to give the men a taste of home, so to speak. So that's a lot of coordination to get these men matched to Jewish community members' homes. And Rabbi Gordon notes, quote, "Unfortunately, some of the hosts found to their dismay that the guests whom they invited never showed up. A few of the servicemen were irresponsible enough to make other plans for the evening without notifying us. Others were shipped out on such short notice that they had no chance to inform us. In either case, the result was that far into the Seder night, we were deluged with telephone calls from hostesses who had been waiting in vain for their guests. 'Where is our soldier?' was the incessant fifth question we heard throughout the Seder night. And I believe that's the only Jewish joke that the rabbi includes in his autobiography, so I had to share it here. After nearly a year at training base in Florida, Rabbi Gordon began a new assignment. In March 1944, he began as circuit chaplain for the North Atlantic Division of the Air Transport Command, a role he held until April 1946, 8 months after the war's end. Described by Rabbi Gordon as probably the most extensive Jewish community in history, his circuit covered some 21,000 miles of flying distance. He began at his base in Presque Isle, Maine. He would then begin the circuit, traveling to Canada, to an area above Canada's St. Lawrence River, 2 bases on Baffin Island near Hudson Bay, and then 2 bases in Newfoundland, then to Greenland, then Meeksfield, Iceland, which is about 35 miles from Reykjavik, then to Prestwick, Scotland, one of the largest bases in the United Kingdom, then to Azores, a cluster of islands off the Portuguese coast, then on to Bermuda, then to LaGuardia Field in New York, then Manchester, New Hampshire, Bangor, Maine, and then finally back home to the base in Presque Isle, Maine. After a while, Washington, D.C. was also added in the loop. Depending on Jewish holidays, inclement weather, or various base needs, his trips and stays at each place varied in length. He did note, however, that, quote, "It was not at all unusual for me to fly 1,000 miles for a stop of no more than 45 minutes. It is from this assignment that we have acquired these amazing photographs detailing Rabbi Gordon's journey, and it is those northern stations where we got that dog sledding rabbi." As Rabbi Gordon traveled his circuit, he brought with him a Torah, to be known as the Flying Torah. There were a total of 2 different Torahs that he traveled with. The first was lent to him by Beth Israel Synagogue in Bangor, Maine. A portable chest was constructed that held not only the Torah, but also prayer books, a bottle of wine, a Kiddush cup, prayer shawls, kippot, and other religious materials. For his personal belongings, Rabbi Gordon had to pack a wide range of clothes. Going from Arctic Iceland to tropical Bermuda, he had to be prepared for all weather. He also carried with him various English and Yiddish periodicals and supplies of kosher salami and canned food to share. At a certain point, it appears that this became a bit too much to carry. So Rabbi Gordon traded his heavy first Torah in for a smaller Torah scroll from his alma mater, the Jewish Theological Seminary. This new, smaller Torah also had a specific carrying case crafted for it, making it appear like a portable mini ark. Quote, "When closed, the chest looked like an ordinary suitcase, but when it was set up on end, a pair of doors marked the first 10 letters of the Hebrew alphabet to symbolize the 10 commandments, opened from the center like the doors of the standard Ark of Law. Inside, there was an electric eternal light with a cord which could be connected to any electric outlet. Rabbi Gordon surmised that this Torah most likely traveled a greater number of miles than any other Torah that existed at the time." The photographs we have show the variety of locations where Rabbi Gordon was stationed around North Atlantic. And some of my favorite photographs are those where he poses proudly with the Torah. Torah on a dog sled, Torah on the bow of a ship, Torah getting into an airplane. These photos are staged, of course, but Rabbi Gordon was proud of bringing the Torah to all of these places. He discussed the importance of his work. Quote, "In those dark days, flames were devouring scrolls of the law in many parts of Nazi-dominated Europe. Simultaneous, in symbolic defiance, in my hands there was a Torah soaring over oceans and ice caps to carry the word of God to Jews fighting for the preservation of freedom and justice." And to me, this is really a powerful description of what really strikes home how Rabbi Gordon perceived his work and his faith in the time of the Holocaust. Rabbi Gordon's work focused on providing strong spiritual leadership. He mentions in his autobiography that he reminded service members of Kiddush Hashem, which Rabbi Gordon defined as, quote, the duty of every Jew, no matter where he was or what he did, to uphold the good name of his faith and his people by his own exemplary conduct. I urge the boys to keep in mind that they might well be the first Jews who their non-Jewish fellow soldiers had ever met. In time, some of these non-Jewish GIs may become leading citizens of their hometowns, and their recollection of their contacts with Jews in the army could shape their actions when they attained positions of power. As a consequence, every Jew would do well to remember that he held the honor of his people in his hands. And I imagine that this was a tough burden to uphold, especially considering many of these men were in their youthful 20s. Rabbi Gordon provided assistance in both the good and the bad. He officiated weddings, though dissuading Jewish servicemen who were entering into interfaith marriages. And he assisted people who wanted to keep kosher, despite being stationed in remote places with small, if any, local Jewish service. I enjoy the photographs where Rabbi Gordon is shown preparing materials for Passover, loading boxes of matzah into airplanes. Again, he really seems to enjoy Passover. He mentions that Passover 1945 was nearly canceled after a boat carrying the matzah, Passover wine, and other Passover food from the Jewish Welfare Board was torpedoed on its way to Iceland. He was able to secure an emergency shipment of matzah and personally flew it to Iceland, saving Passover 1945 for those stationed there. Rabbi Gordon also saw himself as a Goodwill Ambassador, and part of that was assisting his fellow chaplains of other faiths. One year, he was tasked with delivering Christmas packages to non-Jewish servicemen also stationed in these far-flung bases. He spoke of that year as the most special. Quote, many of the gift packages I carried with me landed on Baffin Island. The servicemen on that far northern outpost, however, felt that they already had everything they needed. And instead, they wanted to bring Christmas cheer to the Eskimos who were less fortunate than they. A special Christmas party was therefore held, at which Christmas gifts from Minnesota were distributed to the Eskimos. Rabbi Gordon here uses an outdated colonialist term, Eskimo, to describe the native Inuit population. There's a number of photographs of this event, and before I read his writings, I had no idea as to the background of this story. Again, Rabbi Gordon saw part of his work as bringing honor to all Jews by spreading general goodwill. The war came to a close in 1945, and by May 1946, Rabbi Gordon left active service with the rank of major. The collection we have ends there, but he went on to the civilian chaplaincy and worked with the New York Board of Rabbis. When he began there, the group represented 250 Orthodox, conservative, and Reform rabbis throughout the state of New York. Under his leadership, that number rose to over 1,000. In 1956, he was named as the board's executive vice president and director. He served as chaplain at hospitals, mental health institutions, prisons, youth shelters, and nursing homes. His traveling experience undoubtedly inspired him in creating the International Synagogue that is located at JFK Airport in New York. Indeed, he continued his world travels, most notably entering into the Soviet Union in 1956 with the New York Board of Rabbi delegation, one of the first rabbinical groups to enter the Soviet Union in over 40 years. He would go on to lecture about the plight of Soviet Jewry throughout the 60s and 70s. In May 1977, at the age of 69, Rabbi Harold Hirsch Gordon passed away after suffering a heart attack. He never married or had children, but the impact of his life was keenly felt, as evidenced by his obituary in the New York Times and the American Jewish World. His funeral happened in New York, but he was laid to rest at the Adath Yeshurun Cemetery in Edina, Minnesota, where his father and mother are also buried. After all his years of traveling, he returned to rest in Minnesota. The collection of materials we have were donated by Harold's niece, Joy Gordon, and they document a unique rabbinical career, one that included dog sledding with a Torah. The photographs are a rich resource, and all of these have been digitized and are available online through UMedia, available for anyone around the world to access. And in doing so, the Flying Torah continues to travel the world. Thank you. So now I would like to introduce my colleague, Amanda Wick, who is the interim curator of the Charles Babbage Institute Archives and the processing archivist of the Carlson Company corporate records and family papers. And she will be talking about the ultra entrepreneur, Curt Carlson.
Thank you, Kate. So again, my name is Amanda Wick, and I am the processing archivist for the Carlson Company's corporate records and family papers collection, as well as the curator for the Charles Babbage Institute archives here in the libraries. I'd like to start off first by thanking Kate for such a great presentation. Like Kate, I am also going to be talking about one of our own legendary Minnesotans. The Carlson name is likely familiar to everyone on this webinar. It is, after all, the name on the business school at the University of Minnesota. In fact, that Carlson is the same individual who I will be speaking about today, Curtis Leroy Carlson, founder of, originally, the Gold Bond Stamp Company, which later became the Carlson Companies. The company exists today in the hands of third-generation family ownership and is one of the largest private family-owned companies in the country. Curtis Carlson, or Curt, as I've come to call him after years of living with his papers, was a monumental figure in the Minnesota business community. He was born and raised in Edina, later attending the U of M before starting the Gold Bond Stamp Company in 1938. The company eventually became one of the largest stamp and couponing companies in the country, and later became a major powerhouse in the travel and hospitality industries, owning brands like Radisson Hotels, TGI Fridays, Country Inn and Country Kitchen, Thomas Cook Travel, and Ask Mr. Foster, which is the oldest personal travel agency in the world and founded in the 1880s. In addition to his immense success in business, Curt was also an incredible philanthropist, donating more than $30 million to the University of Minnesota and supporting organizations such as the United Way, the Hennepin Avenue Methodist Church, the Minnesota Opera, and the Minnesota Symphony, amongst so many others. Given his strong ties to the university and the Twin Cities, the family elected to donate the entirety of the corporate records of the company, as well as Curt Carlson's personal papers to the university. The Carlson Company's corporate records and family papers collection arrived at the university in December of 2014. When it arrived, it included about 1,200 banker's boxes and 15 pallets of unboxed artifacts, artwork, and memorabilia. Altogether, it took up almost twice the square footage of Anderson Library's loading dock, for those of you who might have been on one of our cabin tours in the past, with boxes stacked 5 high. So this is a view of just the banker's boxes, and it's a little hard to tell, but the boxes are on pallets that each contain 40. So you can see that we're covering a pretty large amount of real estate. A team of 5 staff members processed its collection over the course of a year, and today it is open for research with permission from a Carlson Companies representative and consists of roughly 900 boxes. From the start, the collection represents innumerable rabbit holes to meander into. From a small collection of newspaper clippings documenting a horrific murder spree in Jamaica in the 1950s that Curt thought might be a possible threat to business interests, to the records of the nation's first travel agency, Ask Mr. Foster, as well as an entire set of the Gold Bond Stamp Company's Company China. This collection has a little bit of everything related to the business of the Carlson Companies. In addition, a variety of family photo albums and personal correspondence, personal effects, and family artifacts are also represented, such as the architectural plans and extensive renovation blueprints for many of Curt Carlson's family properties. So here is just a small sample of items found within the collection. You can see a Gold Bond cruel work motto crafted by the wife of an early employee, family photos from professional scrapbooks, some stamp books, gift catalogs, engravings of the first contract signed between Gold Bond and a major supermarket chain, portraits of Curt, early Ask Mr. Foster advertising work, and gold bond photography. So that would include stores and groundbreakings. For Curt Carlson's for Curt Carlson, the line between business and personal was exceedingly fine. And thus we have so much of his personal papers interspersed with corporate records. Included within those personal papers are records related to his political affiliations and to the many organizations of which he was a member. And this sets the stage for today's talk, which is the intersection of business and politics and all of the hidden social networks that facilitate this intersectionality. I should also note that all of the images within this presentation come from materials within Curt Carlson's personal papers, as opposed to corporate records, further emphasizing, but they're still within this larger body of records, further emphasizing how fine that line can be between personal and business. In retrospect, the theme of this talk seems remarkably prescient for today's political environment, and we're going to be focusing on how Curt Carlson's network of social clubs, societies, and membership organizations brought him into contact with two individuals. I could have picked from any number of them, but two individuals that I found to be the most interesting, which include Dr. Edward Teller and Hubert Humphrey and their different political goals. So each of these characters represents a very different side of Curt Carlson's political interests. Hubert Humphrey was the guardian of his business and social and cultural interests. And Edward Teller was the focal point for another small, much smaller area of political interest, which included civil defense, space exploration, and nuclear energy. Curt Carlson, like so many powerful men of his time, was an active member of a variety of organizations. And this is just a small sample of the organizations to which he belonged. The Shriners, the Jesters, Scottish Rite Freemasonry, Sigma Phi Epsilon fraternity, his church, the Hennepin Avenue Methodist Church, several country clubs, Wayzata, Minikata Club, the Minneapolis Club, and the Minneapolis Athletic Club. He was also an honored guest and applicant to the Bohemian Club in San Francisco, and a member of a somewhat informal hunting club in Texas, and more on those two shortly. But first, I'd like to examine one of two unique connections Curt made through his social groups that are documented in the collection. And the first is Edward Teller, who was born in 1908 in Budapest, Austria-Hungary. He left his homeland in 1926 and received his higher education in Germany, where he studied under famous scientists Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr. In 1935, Teller was invited to the US to become a professor of physics at the George Washington University, where he was engaged as a theoretical physicist. In 1941, after becoming a naturalized citizen of the US, his interest turned to the use of nuclear energy, both fusion and fission, for the science-minded of us. In 1942, Teller was invited to be part of Robert Oppenheimer's summer planning seminar at UC Berkeley, which is famous for the origins of the Manhattan Project. And in 1943, he headed a group at Los Alamos himself in the theoretical physics department. However, his obsession with the hydrogen bomb caused tensions with other scientists, particularly Hans Bethe, the division leader, and Oppenheimer himself, who wanted to focus primarily on the atomic bomb over the H-bomb, so nuclear fission over fusion. And it was during Oppenheimer's security clearance hearings in 1954 that the final rift occurred between Teller and many of his scientific colleagues. At the hearings, Teller testified against Oppenheimer receiving top-level clearance, stating, "I feel I would prefer to see the vital interests of this country in hands that I understand better and therefore trust more." A large part of the scientific community who were already dismayed at the witch hunts of the McCarthy era and aware of a long-standing friction between Dr. Teller and Dr. Oppenheimer remained loyal to the scientific leader of the atomic bomb project and turned their back on Dr. Teller. However, Dr. Teller continued to be highly regarded in many political quarters, and his role as an advisor to those in high places increased. Starting in the early 1960s, Dr. Teller promoted the hydrogen bomb as an effective deterrent in nuclear proliferation. At this point, he was awarded the nickname the father of the hydrogen bomb, a title that he alternately found distasteful and delightful. Incidentally, the title character in the 1964 movie, Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is allegedly modeled on Teller. Between the 50s and the 70s, Dr. Teller was also the chief promoter of Project Plowshare, which is for the use of underground nuclear explosions for peaceful purposes, like releasing fuel from Western oil shale formations, freeing natural gas deposits, or digging a harbor on the west coast of Alaska. And in the 1980s, he championed an anti-missile system for use in space. Its technical allure helped provide momentum for the founding the Strategic Defense Initiative, which we know today as Star Wars. Teller received numerous awards during his career, including the prestigious Presidential Medal of Freedom, and passed away after suffering a stroke in 2003. So that's a great biography of Edward Teller, but how does he intersect with Curt Carlson, a businessman from Minnesota? How did they meet? Well, Teller and Curt met through Dr. J.R. Maxfield's hunting club. Maxfield is an interesting character as well. He was passionate about space exploration, passionate about the peaceful applications of nuclear energy, and he was also a pioneer in the field of nuclear medicine. In fact, he founded the American College of Nuclear Medicine. His relationship to Teller is a little bit murky, but Teller's prominence in the field also likely brought him into contact with Maxfield, who moved in pretty high-level scientific circles. Dr. Maxfield and Carlson may have met through the Bohemian Club. I'm still trying to track down the origins of this relationship, where both were guests of different members. The Bohemian Club has a long and somewhat colorful history. It's a social club in San Francisco Bay Area devoted to the protection of the arts. However, it is also a group of very, very powerful men whose members include names like Henry Kissinger, CEOs and board chairmen of major financial institutions like Bill Schreier of Merrill Lynch and Louis B. Lundborg of Bank of America. And interestingly, the King of Sweden, who was an honorary member. Neither Curt nor Dr. Maxfield were ever full members of the club. Curt did apply for membership in the late 60s, early 70s, and was sponsored by Louis Lundborg and Wayne Thompson of the Dayton-Hudson Corporation. However, the application stagnated and Curt actually ended up withdrawing his application. While they were not necessarily close confidants, Teller and Carlson seem to have had a congenial relationship, facilitated by a great deal of effort from Dr. Maxfield. The three met socially outside of the hunting club, often with members of each other's family. Carlson sought Teller's introduction to the Minneapolis Twin Cities Business and Research Society by pursuing him as a speaker at the university and introduced him to other groups of businessmen to talk about the peaceful use of nuclear energy and his involvement with NASA. The relationship was personal, though. In this letter from Curt Carlson to Teller, he uses the honorific doctor as he sends his condolences to Teller following the disastrous Apollo 1 mission, where 3 crew members died when the rocket failed to launch and exploded. Additional correspondence between Curt and Dr. Teller and Curt and Dr. Maxfield indicate numerous occasions where they mingled socially to mutually advantageous ends. For example, as I mentioned, they attended the Apollo 11 launch together. They met for meals with family, introducing several members of the Carlson family to folks in the Texas medical community. They interacted for business and political causes and seemed to have used each other's connections to further their own goals. So Curt was introduced to key figures in civil defense like Dr. Eugene Wigner and Edwin Meese. Teller to causes that may have helped to reduce his notoriety following the massive fallout of his testimony against Oppenheimer in the security clearance hearings, and Los Alamos. The relationship is especially interesting, to me at least, as the areas that they overlapped in, nuclear, space, civil defense, are the only political causes that I've been able to identify as important, aside from those that directly affected his companies. The next figure we'll look at has a much more clear-cut relationship with Curt Carlson through proximity, mutual admiration and respect, and a long-standing friendship, and that's with Hubert H. Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey was born on May 27, 1911 in Wallace, South Dakota. He left South Dakota to attend the University of Minnesota, but did return to help manage his father's drugstore early in the Depression. He attended the Capital College of Pharmacy in Denver, Colorado, and became a registered pharmacist in 1933. On September 3rd, 1936, Humphrey married Muriel Fay Buck in Huron, South Dakota. He returned to the University of Minnesota and earned his BA degree in 1939. And in 1940, he earned an MA in political science from Louisiana State University, and then returned to Minneapolis to teach and pursue further graduate study. He eventually worked for the Works Progress Administration and ended up leaving further grad school. He moved on from the WPA to a series of positions within wartime agencies, and in 1943, he ran unsuccessfully for mayor of Minneapolis, then returning to teaching as a visiting professor at Macalester College in St. Paul. Between 1943 and 1945, Humphrey worked at a variety of jobs, including teaching at Macalester, serving as a news commentator for radio station WTCN, and managing apartment buildings. In 1945, he was elected mayor of Minneapolis and served until 1948. In 1948, at the Democratic National Convention, he gained national attention when he delivered a stirring speech in favor of a strong civil rights plank in the party's platform. In November of 1948, voters in Minnesota elected Humphrey to the United States Senate. And while in the Senate, he was known as a liberal who was working on issues of civil rights, social welfare, and for fair employment. He served as the Senate Democratic Whip from 1961 to 1964. In 1964, at the Democratic National Convention, President Lyndon B. Johnson asked the convention to select Hubert Humphrey as the vice presidential nominee. The ticket was elected in November in a Democratic landslide. In 1968, Humphrey was the Democratic Party's candidate for president, but he was defeated narrowly by Richard Nixon. After the defeat, Humphrey returned to Minnesota to teach at the University of Minnesota again and Macalester College. He eventually returned to the Senate in 1971, where he won re-election in 1976. He died in 1978 of cancer, and after his death, the governor appointed Humphrey's wife, Muriel Buck Humphrey, to fill the vacant Senate seat. Curt and Hubert Humphrey's relationship was extraordinarily longstanding and rooted in mutual connections, shared values, and interest in advancing Minnesota. They knew each other socially, and in fact, Curt planned Hubert Humphrey's son's bachelor party, and that photo from the previous slide is actually taken at that occasion. They both attended the weddings of each other's respective children, and Curt employed close friends of Humphrey at Gold Bond. In these letters, the two refer to an employee of Curt's, Paul Zarnicki, who was informally adopted by Humphrey's parents and actually grew up with Hubert. The two were very collegial and social with each other's families from the time that Hubert Humphrey was a senator all the way through his campaigns for presidency and up to his death. Gifts that they exchanged included music and books. And in these two letters, Hubert refers to engagements with Curt's family and gifts exchanged, including an Encyclopedia Britannica given to Curt by Hubert Humphrey, and a series of record albums of the Radisson Hotel's house band, the Golden Strings. I should also add as a little bit of an aside that we have an entire collection of those Golden Strings albums as well. And we're looking to digitize them in the future. So I think that could be a really fun collection to add. The two men moved in the same circles, and unlike Teller's connection, which was via these exclusive social clubs, the relationship with Hubert Humphrey was founded on a shared, pragmatic, and profoundly Minnesotan and Midwestern shared set of values. As the senator from Minnesota, Hubert and Curt had numerous interactions regarding policies that would facilitate business for the Gold Bond Stamp Company. Federal legislation regulating the stamp business was often fraught with contention. And indeed, Humphrey relied on Curt's extensive network of businessmen for his various campaigns. Like other aspects of Carlson's life, that line between personal and professional was very, very fine, as I mentioned. And his work on behalf of Hubert Humphrey's political aspirations was no different. He used company resources, staff for the most part, to assist and track his personal fundraising efforts for Humphrey. And because of the nature of the private family-owned company, he occasionally made political contributions through the Gold Bond Stamp Company's coffers. Keep in mind that this was all prior to major campaign finance reform laws. There is nothing shady about this whatsoever. Mostly corporate giving was prohibited for federal elections beginning roughly 1971. So this predates that in the first place. Local and state elections were much more flexible in how they were governed in the 1960s and 70s as well. And Carlson donated quite handily to a variety of candidates from both major parties. Hubert Humphrey, however, did receive the lion's share of Carlson's energetic fundraising activities, especially when running for president in 1968 and 72, and on his behalf when running as part of the LBJ Humphrey ticket. He was a prominent founding member for two major political action campaigns supporting Humphrey in the 1968 presidential election against Nixon, Businessmen for Humphrey Muskie, and the National Committee for the Nomination of Hubert Humphrey. Here you can see the amount that Curt raised for the nominating committee in 1968, $28K, and how much he gave to various political groups in 1964. There's a lot of classic business and political connections that are highlighted in the correspondence between Hubert Humphrey and Curt Carlson. There's the expectation of we raise money for you, we expect to return our investment. And there's just a really great example of this expectation here. Curt was seeking a postmaster appointment for an individual who was exceedingly helpful to Gold Bond in navigating new markets in Wisconsin. And Hubert's response is a very gracious no. Interestingly, it's always clear in their correspondence when Curt is going to ask for a favor. All of these letters are addressed very formally. Dear Mr. Vice President or Dear Senator Humphrey, whereas friendly notes are always Dear Hubert or HHH. All of Hubert's letters remain constant. Dear Curt. While Humphrey and the DNC did secure the larger share of Carlson's efforts on the national stage, he also donated quite a bit to the Republican Party. In fact, during his 1968 election, while being a founding member of 2 Humphrey PACs, he also donated substantially enough to 2 Nixon groups, Democrats and Independents for Nixon, and Independents for Nixon, that he was invited, so much in fact that he was invited to the inauguration on their behalf. This is not uncommon. Curt Carlson, unlike many other well-known businessmen, is not an overtly political figure in the slightest. Certainly not like the Koch brothers or George Soros or even Bill Gates. He may be best described as a political atheist. He supported candidates that would best protect his business, family, and state's interests, and they definitely came from all walks of life and all sides of the political spectrum. After the 1972 election and Humphrey's second failed bid, Curt Carlson, for the most part, walked away from national politics, seeking more relationships with politicians at the state and local level. His business was also becoming increasingly global, so relationships with political figures in these new countries were critical. The one exception proved to be, interestingly, was Jimmy Carter, with whom he seems to have had a personal friendship and also a brief correspondence with Edwin Meese in the Reagan administration, where he attended at least one meeting on civil defense. We see very little of the political activism and political network in his later papers that was so present during the turbulent 60s. Instead, Carlson seemed to focus more on using his networks to support others and benefit the community, bringing in leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev to speak at the Humphrey Institute for Public Affairs, among others. The Carlson Lecture Series, incidentally, at the Humphrey Institute is an incredibly unique aspect for the U. And if you've never attended one, I do hope you get the opportunity to do so in the future. And as I wind up today, I think it's important to recognize the context of the times in which we examine the political and social connections of a figure like Curt Carlson, who is very much an extraordinarily successful man of his time. The landscape of election politics and fundraising was completely different, as I mentioned earlier, but some things do remain the same. And that is the fact that these hidden connections, built and fostered through shared participation in philanthropic and social networks, undergird the entire political and economic landscape in this country. Individuals like Curt Carlson thrived amongst these networks, and he in particular sought opportunities to open them to many others. These are not insignificant changes that he brought to the system and should be recognized as such. He broke into it, made these connections on his own, and then shared them with others to further the success of his company, family, and the state. And that's my talk for the day. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thanks, Kate and Amanda. I see we have a few questions coming in. The first one is for Kate. And someone is asking, I am curious why he is referred to as Reverend and not Rabbi. So this is in reference to something from your talk, Kate, possibly about Jacob and not Harold Gordon. Why Reverend?
Yeah. Yeah, I was also interested in that and tried to find the answer, and it was somewhat unclear. There's a Hebrew word for rabbi, but I think the use of the word reverend, first of all, seemed kind of historical. So maybe it was in part of kind of coming to America and trying to have people understand the role. So I feel like it was partially that, but also there seemed to be some sort of kind of training to it as well. Maybe a hierarchical thing of kind of the training of his background. But I wasn't able to get a clear answer, and I didn't have time to ask a rabbi. So.
The next question also appears to be for Kate. It says, do the rabbi's archives include the names of any of the servicemen he worked with?
Somewhat. So the photographs that include servicemen, none of them are identified. However, in his book, he does mention certain servicemen that he directly worked with, people that supported the chaplaincy in certain ways. I think he also name drops some people that he married, but when he's talking about kind of counseling and issues, he does not mention names.
And here's another question for you, Kate. Did the Flying Jewish Chaplain have a consistent crew that he flew around the world with, or did he fly with different people each time?
That I also wondered and really wasn't able to find an answer. I don't know if it was, the same pilot every time, the same plane every time, but it does appear that he did travel often with other chaplains. He tells in his book an interesting story about one time where things were not going well mid-flight, and the chaplains did pray together. So he does mention that, and he had relationships with the chaplains. He also discusses just the nature of flight and kind of a like an autograph book for all of the people that he met while flying. And I would love to know where that ended up. It would be really interesting.
Great. And then the next is actually more of a comment than a question. This is from one of the staff, and it's about Amanda's presentation. FYI, $28,000 in 1965 is equivalent in purchasing power to about $235,446.22 today that Carlson raised for Humphrey. This is something we do in archives pretty regularly. We'll see an amount, and then we'll run it through a dollar converter or an inflation converter to find out what that amount means in today's dollars. So thanks for that information. Do we have any other questions for any of our presenters today? We have time for one or two more if there's something you're curious about.
It looks like there's one in the chat for Amanda.
Oh.
I'll read it out loud. How does Carlson feel about the public turning on Humphrey because of the Vietnam War?
And that's a great question. In all of the conversations with Humphrey, Curt is just a dedicated supporter. They were incredibly close friends, families as well, practically family. I think I don't really have a huge amount of information other than correspondence between the two of them. So, you rarely see anything in reference to that particular event. But from the correspondence of the time, Curt does, from that date range, Curt does spend a decent amount of time encouraging Humphrey to keep going, to keep working on behalf of the state. And to keep promoting his, what he stands for. So they remained friends throughout. And I think that's, that it's really a testament to their friendship and their relationship.
We have another question for Kate. Did Rabbi Gordon interact with servicemen from other nations? And the person asking had an uncle in the Canadian forces.
Yes, he talks about in his book, while he was at bases, kind of meeting people from those areas. So he talks about when he was in Iceland, there's not at the time, a large Jewish population in Iceland. And so kind of what that was like. He also talks about Canadian servicemen and talks pretty frankly about the anti-Semitism that some of the Canadian service members that he encountered. And he kind of guesses as to potentially why that might be. But yeah, he does in his autobiography talk a little bit about all of these kinds of places and the people that he met, also just kind of local community members, as well as other servicemen.
And I think we have just enough time for this one last question. And Amanda, this is for you. Why was the gold bond stamp program discontinued? I remember hours of fun filling in the books with my mom.
Well, it's a real big bummer. The Gold Bond Stamp Company, like other trading stamp companies, ended up shutting down or transferring to different business models, mostly because there were massive amounts of litigation happening in the industry. And so it really became something that was just very hard to compete with. Also, a number of merchants decided to offer couponing type deals and rewards, and kind of created these rewards programs for their customers on their own, as opposed to working with a vendor like Gold Bond Stamp Company or one of the others. So again, it really just comes down to a lot of lawyers and regulation. And then also the stores choosing to go after a similar program by themselves.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda and Kate, for the presentations. And this concludes First Fridays Online for the 2020-2021 season. We made it. Thanks for joining us. And a special thanks to all of our presenters, our ASL interpreters, and to Mike Sutliff from U of M Libraries Technology Support for running Zoom behind the scenes, and to Caitlin Marino for keeping us all organized. We are excited for next season, and we will be making plans over the summer for either online, in-person, or hybrid presentations. So please plan to join us again in October, and you can keep up with news about First Fridays and other events at continuum.umn.edu. Remember to check the library's YouTube channel in a few weeks for a recording of today's presentations. Thanks, and we'll see you in the fall.